Gents, thanks for taking the time to chat with me here at Surface Navy's issue. So kind of walk me through why you commissioned this study. What was the Navy doing wrong that necessitated the look that you guys took?
Well, thanks for the time, Jeff. It's great to see you here. And what drove the study really was the need for the Surface Navy to be redesigned, re-architected to support both the fiscal constraints the Navy is likely to be under, but also address the great power competition challenges they're likely to face. So we saw the direction that the Surface Navy was going was in the wrong direction, given the challenges and the threats, and also how much money is going to be available to the Navy. And so that's what we proposed, this rebalancing of the surface fleet and a redesign around a new set of platforms.
So what is that new surface fleet that you guys are proposing in this study?
I'll let Tim talk about that to a lot of that, but the main thing is we're rebalancing the surface fleet away from a small number of large surface combatants, which is kind of today's surface Navy, towards a larger surface Navy that is a larger number of smaller combatants. That saves money, it increases the complexity of the force to support distributed operations, it improves the defensive capacity of the force, and it also improves the offensive capacity of the force and better distributes that offensive capacity. So we feel like that's a much better force for the Navy for the future.
Exactly. I think one of the major differences between our plan and the Navy's is that instead of procuring a cruiser-like future large surface combatant, we propose a destroyer-sized DDGX. Originally, the Navy planned on procuring a replacement to the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in fiscal year 2030. But a couple years ago, they accelerated that to fiscal year 2025. We think that rushing the replacement for the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer with a new large surface combatant is risky, and it's likely to result in a ship that's over budget, delivered late, and falls short of requirements. So instead, we propose that the Navy take its time to develop and mature some of these key technologies like electric drive, automation, and directed energy that it needs on the large surface combatant. And then in 2030, building a destroyer-sized DDGX that would cost about $2.5 billion instead of the cruiser-sized future large surface combatant that would cost about $2.8 billion. This helps put the Navy on the right trajectory and breaks it off the current path in which it's headed towards an ever smaller fleet of expensive ships.
And so one other thing you guys had in your study from reading it through was the need to increase the salvo size that an enemy force would need to do to overwhelm the surface fleet. So is that adding more capable missiles? Is that adding more missiles for air defense?
Right.
Other things like directed energy for air and missile defense? What does that mean?
Yeah, so fundamentally, if we're going to have the Navy operating in places like the South and East China Sea, where they're going to be under the threat of a large number of weapons from Chinese mainland as well as Chinese ships, you've got to be able to have each individual ship better protected, which means dialing in the range at which we do air defense. Instead of trying to shoot down every missile 100 miles away from the ship, you got to start shooting things closer to the ship, which means I can now use lasers, I can use high power microwave, I can use shorter range interceptors like the ESSM that are smaller, and I can carry more of them on my ship. All of those increase the defensive capacity of each ship. And then on top of that, by expanding the number of ships, you increase the number of targets an enemy's going to have to engage, which dilutes their attacks over that large number of targets, increasing the salvo size the enemy's going to have to launch in order to defeat that naval force. And that might dissuade them from the aggression in the first place, or it's certainly going to slow down their active aggression once they start it.
So walk me through kind of the structure of the fleet you're looking at. Is it a majority unmanned? Is it a majority manned small ships? What's your vision here?
So we saw that the balance needs to shift dramatically away from where it is today. So the Navy is driving towards a fleet of 105 or so large surface combatants, about 50 small surface combatants, and then some number of unmanned vessels, which is probably relatively small. We shift that to instead have a fleet that's only got about 70 large surface combatants and has about 100 small surface combatant corvettes that replace the Navy's current plan for a large unmanned surface vessel. We also add in the Navy's current plan to build about 50 frigates that are going to be small surface combatants as well. So it really flips the balance of the fleet away from the large surface combatants towards these smaller combatants. And also a fundamental change is we get away from the large unmanned surface vehicle and instead make that an optionally unmanned corvette.
And Tim, what's your take there from your perspective?
Exactly. It's a key shift. I think one of the areas that we double down on is introducing the medium unmanned surface vessel. So we recommend 110 of these to be operating within the fleet to be able to provide ISR, counter-ISR, and deception, and then some ASW support for the fleet. So in order to be able to conduct distributed operations, we're going to need many of these relatively cheap unmanned, medium unmanned surface vessels to operate throughout the fleet. Also, as Bryan pointed out, our shift from the large unmanned surface vessel to the optionally unmanned corvette is a pretty significant one. we felt that the Navy's LUSV would likely end up being about a 2,000-ton vessel that would cost between $200 to $300 million, but would be difficult to employ during the competition phase. This is because adversaries like China's maritime militia may attempt to harass it, to crowd it out of an area, or could even attempt to illegally board it to steal sensitive components like weapon parts. So instead, we recommend that the Navy use an optionally unmanned corvette that would have 15 to 24 personnel on it normally. It would be primarily armed with offensive weapons, and it would operate with force packages of frigates and destroyers during regular operations. This would allow the Navy to have an off-board magazine on these corvettes that could be easier to use, and because the corvettes would be highly automated and autonomous, if for certain missions during a conflict the Navy wanted to take the personnel off, it could do so and the ship could operate in a fully unmanned mode.
Yep. And so fundamentally, we shift the Navy or the surface fleet away from having about 150 ships, 2/3 of which are large surface combatants that are expensive to buy and maintain, towards a fleet of about 350 ships, of which about a quarter are these large surface combatants, and the rest are 100 unmanned surface vessels, 100 of these small corvettes, and then about 50 of your frigates that the Navy's already planned on.
So I think it's safe to say this plan kind of blows right through that magic number of 355 that's always seemed to hear about. Was that a consideration you guys had when you were putting this together?
The consideration we had was how do we make the fleet cheaper, in addition to making it more capable against our adversaries. And so that was a primary consideration. So by making the fleet larger, but making it composed of more small surface combatants, we drive down the cost to buy the fleet significantly, and also the cost to operate and maintain it significantly as well. So the fleet we're proposing costs about a third to a quarter less than the Navy's current plan if they stay on today's trajectory, which I think is important considering the Navy's already arguing they need more money for the current fleet, and I think it's very unlikely they're going to get that either from another service or from an increased top line for the DoD.
And so that also kind of brings up the realistic side of this, looking at the American shipbuilding base, which hasn't exactly been in the best of health over the recent years. So how do you think they'll be able to build this amount of ships if their plan was put in place?
They could certainly build it. It would be a matter of retooling a little bit to build these smaller combatants in serial production rather than building the larger combatants at a slower rate. So we still would argue continuing to build the DDG Flight 3, DG-51 Flight 3 for the next decade or so, which would keep our current large shipyards in business. But we also propose this large number of small combatants that could go both to those yards or to a number of other yards that are smaller shipbuilders that just don't get as much Navy business today. Places like VT Halter or Eastern down in the Gulf Coast. Okay.
And so with that, and kind of the other question is, where does the LCS fit in all this?
So LCS will be a key platform within the fleet. We're requiring over 30 of them. So we considered what are the best ways to cost effectively improve the effectiveness of that ship. And we found, I guess, two general lines of effort. One was by hardening the ship, so by giving it some low cost but high value improvements like potential rapid fire guns like mad fire systems to increase its defensive capacity, adding some offensive capability like the naval strike missile, and then also viewing what are ways in which we could use LCS to act as command and control platforms for other small and medium unmanned surface vessels that will operate throughout the fleet. So as you correctly point out, LCS will be critical, and we just have to figure out what's the best way to use that platform while still going forward on the new FFGX.